In today's video, I thought we'd talk about FSR 3 as well as FSR 3.1, which is a technology that AMD introduced last year that essentially allows frames to be generated in between two frames to essentially give you higher FPS or a smoother gameplay. Now, the 3.1 differs in a couple of ways to 3 in that it's working independently of any other upscaling technology. So in other words, with 3.1, you can just turn on frame generation, and even if you've got an Nvidia card, for instance, you can have DLSS going and other things like reflex and having that on plus a boost in the games whilst you're utilizing frame generation. So in other words, it's a better implementation of AMD's currently existing FSR 3. And the easiest way to think of this is like taking one step forward with your regular gaming. It's gonna be fast, it's gonna be quick, but then with frame generation, it's like taking one step backwards and then two steps forward. There's gonna be a bit of that delay, but you're going to get ultimately more steps in the process for the same amount of input. So in today's video, we're going to check out two older graphics cards and see how they perform before and after using FSR 3. This card on the right is the GTX 1060 6GB, and then this card right here is the RX 5500 XT. Both are amazing options on the used market, and in fact, you can pick up either of these cards usually for around $50 US, which makes them an absolute bargain. It also makes things like FSR 3 potentially open up a lot more value for GPUs like this. So let's get on to testing out these two older cards and see how much value FSR 3 can add to these used bargains right here, right after today's video sponsor.
If you want to get rid of this annoying activate Windows message, then today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered for as little as $15 US. After you enter that coupon code BFTYC, you can cop yourself a legit single end user license today. Also works for Windows 11 Pro too. Links in description below.
Welcome back to Tech Yes City. Today we're going to be testing out 5 different games, both from the newly created FSR 3.1 list as well as the FSR 3 list on older cards, just to see how well this stuff can work and what you can expect to get out of it, both in terms of image fidelity as well as FPS increases. Though before we get on to testing these games, the backstory here is that Nvidia released frame generation with their RTX 4000 series cards. And although it worked quite well, it did add some input delay. And the biggest problem with frame generation on Nvidia's side was it was only usable on their RTX 4000 series graphics cards, which a lot of people, myself included, raised the question of, well, if you're buying a newer card that's more powerful, do you really need those technologies as opposed to the older cards, say GTX 10 series or RTX 2000 series cards, that could definitely benefit, and especially in the case of the RTX 2000, these cards could definitely benefit a lot more from frame generation than the new RTX 4000 series cards. And so then AMD came along with their FSR 3, and they said, well, look, we're going to give it to everyone, whether you've got an AMD card, an Nvidia card, or even an Intel Arc card. Intel Arc jokes. All we need is a battle mage to come along and make things better. Though before we get onto the games tested, I do have to point out one more thing. When I was looking up FSR 3, just to really know the differences and hopefully get some big sliders and side-by-side comparisons from AMD themselves, all I saw on the website was this crappy GIF image. So maybe AMD could update their website with a slider that shows you, say, nothing and FPS counter versus FSR 3 versus FSR 3.1, rather than this like GIF image. So we've just finished up testing out the two graphics cards here, the 5500 XT and the 1060 in the FSR 3.1 title. That's Spider-Man Miles Morales. Now, this title, unfortunately on the GTX 1060, it was presenting some weird errors. So initially we'd try to boot it up with FSR frame generation, and then the FPS was just extremely low. So there was clearly some kind of bug going on here. And the weird thing was, I then turned it off and the FPS went back to normal, getting around 60 to 70 average FPS. And then I decided, okay, well, there's an error report being produced here, so something is going wrong, it's crashing, it's just not working properly with the 1060. But then I changed over to the 5500 XT and it's working really well. The before and after FPS, you're getting, I would say, maybe around a 45% boost in FPS. With the visuals, there was nothing really standing out as being really bad. I can show you guys in slow-mo so you can see before and after what's going on, and I think it's a really good picture from what I'm seeing so far with the 3.1. However, one thing is in the menu here, you'll notice that when you go to the frame generation, it still says frame generation generates additional frames using the data of previous frames. DLSS frame generation requires a GeForce RTX 40 series graphics cards. And so for me, that seems like the issue with the GTX 1060 is actually trying to use DLSS frame generation, and it's just bugging out the game. So I guess if you guys wanted to know if you need a 4000 series card to use DLSS 3, maybe this game gives you the answer with this bug that shouldn't have come out. But that being said, it doesn't have an RTX processing portion, so maybe the RTX 2000 series card could be different. So we've now got an RTX 3070. I had to quickly test this, even though we're focusing on older GPUs in today's video. I just had to know if this frame generation was working properly on a 3070, unlike the 1060, and it is indeed working properly and giving out a lot higher of an FPS number to the tune of around 50%. So it could be that frame generation FSR 3 is actually working properly on the 3070, but it could also be that perhaps this bug has answered that year-old question, or even like 1.5-year-old question of, do the 3000 and 2000 series cards, could they utilize DLSS 3? I mean, you'd have to get into the code. This update definitely, I think, could answer that question for a lot of people who are looking for that answer. Now I'm kind of confused, because it felt like the 1060 was trying to run DLSS 3 rather than actual FSR 3. And then, I mean, since this is an Nvidia card too, perhaps, it could be the answer that we're all looking for. I don't know. Mystery in a video. Let's get on to some FSR 3 titles and see how well this works on the 1060 as well as the 5500 XT. And the first game that we've got here is Starfield. And after testing this game out with FSR 3 enabled, I was indeed extremely impressed. At 1080p medium quality settings, our frames went from, on average, with the 5500 XT, from about 49 to then over 87. So then we went to the GTX 1060 and it was even more impressive in my opinion. We went from a sloppy 33 average FPS to then up to 59 average FPS. So getting near that 60 smooth average FPS, and the game didn't look too bad. Now keep in mind, I did have to play around with the settings to get the best desirable experience for the FPS being displayed, because for instance, if I put it on low quality settings, I'd get a little bit more FPS, but it was just looking absolutely horrendous. But then on medium, I found I got the best settings between FPS smoothness as well as visual fidelity. So what about moving around in this game? Was there any noticeable shimmering or just visual artifacting when we're playing this game? And the answer here was no. I was actually extremely impressed with how things were turning out in this game. And if there were any issues, then the aliasing was doing a great job of masking that. Now, the biggest point here was the actual input delay on this game. It felt really good. So in other words, turning on FSR 3 in Starfield is just going to give you a much better experience in this game, especially if you're on older cards like the 5500 XT or the GTX 1060. So next up here, we've tested out Robocop, and this was a game where I've got some mixed opinions in terms of FSR 3. The first noticeable problem I had was even when I was just moving up the staircase, there was just some weird kind of artifacting going on, especially with the text. But when I was playing as well, especially unfortunately on the 5500 XT here, even though it was getting higher FPS, and I'll show you guys the FPS numbers that we're getting here, we're getting around 85 average FPS on the 5500 XT, and then on the GTX 1060, we're getting around 65, I think. And so the FPS was definitely scaling better on the 5500 XT if we were to look at it in that manner, going from 40 without FSR 3 on to 48 with the 5500 XT. But the problem here is that the 5500 XT had noticeable input delay, and same with the 1060. It was actually pretty unbearable. I didn't want to play this game in its default FSR 3 configuration. But then when I turned on reflex for the 1060 and I put it on the on plus boost setting, I was actually extremely impressed with how much that brought down the input latency and just made it a playable experience with extra FPS. So in other words, if you've got a GTX 1060 and you've got that reflex setting available and you can turn it on plus boost, it's actually going to do a really good job in conjunction with FSR 3. So this is kind of like another big win. Just like Starfield, I thought that was a big win. Robocop Rogue City is looking like it's a big win, despite some visual artifacting, which really didn't bother me. It's just, I was just noticing it and reporting on it. But it's more so the fact that it works better on a GTX 1060 than it does on the AMD 5500 XT. So in other words, I would actually really love to see Reflex just be available for all graphics cards if possible. And so with FSR 3, really liking what I see. Let's try out these other two games that I guess aren't as mainstream as the two that we've just tested here. And now next up here, we have a game called Nightingale. And even though the sad thing was here, even though this game was on the list of FSR 3 supported titles, I actually have no idea how you can enable FSR 3 on this title. It's not showing up anywhere in the game. Like, we've got no option here either to put it in direct full screen mode. There's also no FSR 3 showing up when it comes to FSR frame generation. There's just no option to turn it on here. But what I decided to do was check out the FPS anyway with the 1060 versus the 5500 XT. And what we saw here was the 5500 XT was giving about 25% more performance, but also the FSR quality settings here did a better job, I feel, than Intel XS, as well as the TSR, that did quite well too. So it's kind of like a toss-up between FSR 2 and TSR. I'd say if you want a more sharpened look, then FSR is definitely going to provide that with the sharpening filters. But with TSR, that's going to give you, I feel, like a more smooth experience and definitely get you higher FPS. Also, if we turn off the scaling, the game does go down, especially in the case of the GTX 1060. It does go down to pretty bad frame rates, around 30 FPS, which for me personally makes it quite unplayable. But it was unfortunate to see that this game was on AMD's FSR 3 supported title list, but it's just, there's no option to turn it on. And so that's kind of like what's going on here. Like, GIFs on the website AMD and then saying there's titles that have FSR 3 and then they just don't have it in the menu. And the last title we're going to pull up here is Houseflipper 2. Now, I saw this on the list of FSR 3 supported titles. Unfortunately, when I was going into the settings, I just like Nightingale, I have no option here for frame generation. It doesn't show up anywhere, even if we lock in the FSR settings and we try to then play around with different settings just to see if there's an unlock once we turn on FSR. And unfortunately, there is nothing here. But at least the good news here is that the FSR itself, or the game itself, plays really well at 1080p on, say, like a high or medium settings on both these graphics cards to begin with. So because it's a house flipping simulator, I just don't think you're going to really have a huge desire to get, say, 144 FPS in this game. I mean, 60 is going to be absolutely fine for a game like this. But that being said, having FSR 3 on the list, I would like to see it, just like Nightingale, actually work and be on the list. So it's kind of a shame to see that there was another game, this is 2 out of 4 titles that I've selected on this list, just not having FSR 3 in the options menu. And so wrapping things up with FSR 3, at this point in time, it can work extremely well. I think Starfield was the best example of when FSR can do its best, and that is pretty much no noticeable add-on in terms of input delay, but also increasing the frame rates significantly to the point where you're just getting now a really good experience on a game with older graphics cards like the 1060 that you otherwise wouldn't have got. Though the 2 games out of 4 just not being supported at all, and then saying they're supported, does give me some cause for concern. What's the future of FSR 3? Are we going to see it much more widespread than it actually is or was promised? And also when it comes to game developers implementing this, is it going to be on the game developer to do it, or is it going to be on the individual? Because I have looked around and there are FSR 3 mods you can do to essentially unlock FSR 3 in any game. The problem is when you start messing around with DLL files, at least in my experience, you can come into a lot of weird problems, glitching, crashes, the list goes on. Though I might be a little bit out of line here with this next saying, but if I am, just pull me up in the comments. But I probably speak on behalf of a lot of guys who just don't have a whole lot of free time. The least desirable thing that you want to do when you're time strapped is mod games and only to have problems and things crashing. For instance, when it comes to car problems, I've never met someone in life who's like, yeah man, I just can't wait to buy a car, have the thing break down and fix it up. So when it comes to modding games, I could go down that route. If you guys have had experience in FSR 3 modding games, what's your positives and negatives? I'd love to read comments in relation to that. But the fact is, here we've got games officially on this list from AMD that have maybe had FSR 3 implemented and then they've taken it away, so there's been problems, or they just haven't flat out implemented it because it was too problematic to begin with. And that's kind of concerning. And if those guys can't get FSR 3 to work properly, what chance am I gonna have to get it to work properly? Though all that said, the fact that AMD have made FSR 3 open source and also that it can work extremely well, especially on our old price performance beast used graphics cards, really gives me promise for this, and I do hope to see it, especially in titles where, like for instance Starfield, you do struggle to get every single FPS out of your graphics card. So I'm looking forward to seeing what FSR 3 has installed in the future, and also if perhaps Nvidia can sort of bring in some sort of mainstream FSR competitor, not just having frame generation DLSS 3 on their RTX 4000 series cards exclusively. I would like to see a lot of these older cards just get that support and love and make them more relevant for a lot of titles coming out today. And especially in these troubling economic times, a lot of us just want to get the most out of what we got, and FSR 3 can definitely help you not just get the most out of what you got, get even more. So that's a great thing to see. And speaking of economics, guys, if you guys want an economics update relating to tech and what's been going down lately, I can update you with another video too, so do stay tuned for that. People have been requesting that. Lots changed in the last couple of months. Anyhow, I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. Do let us know in the comments what you think of frame generation. Is it something you do like turning on, or is it something that you leave off? Are you on a potato? Are you on a decent graphics card, or are you on a high-end GPU? Love reading those thoughts and opinions as always. And with that aside, I'll see you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.